Now we're moving on and we're going to talk about artificial selection, which is basically selection for characteristics that we as humans find advantageous, and also a very quick mention on some evidence for evolution. So first of all, what is artificial selection? Well, artificial selection is exactly the same as natural selection. The only difference being that the traits that are identified as being advantageous that will be passed on to offspring and future generations are determined by humans. So humans are the selectors. Great example of artificial selection is the breeding of dogs to create all these hundreds of different breeds of dogs. Okay, that's an example of man selecting for certain traits or characteristics and developing lines or lineages of dogs that exemplify those particular characteristics. Other great examples include things like in agriculture, the development, for example, of broccoli versus Brussels sprouts versus cauliflower. Those all come from the same parent plant that has been artificially selected for different qualities in order to create new species, in essence, a species that we call broccoli, a species we call Brussels sprouts, a species we call cauliflower. Same thing as natural selection, but man is the one deciding which traits are going to be the advantageous ones. Now, very briefly here, I want to just touch for just a moment on this idea of all the different evidence for evolution and remind you again of our discussion of what the word theory means in scientific lingo and how that differs from the way we use the word theory in layman discussion. The theory of evolution means that it has been repeatedly supported by thousands and thousands of experiments across dozens of different disciplines. I've listed for you here an example of just some, not all, just some of the different scientific disciplines that have all conducted experiments and studies which the results of which have supported time and again evolution and the hypothesis of natural selection. And they include things like biogeography, ecology, artificial breeding, organic chemistry, paleontology, functional morphology, comparative embryology, behavior, there's cellular biology, lots of different examples. So again, when we have overwhelming support of a hypothesis, that hypothesis is elevated to a theory or also called a law. I know you've heard that time and again, but I think it's really critical that you come away from this class with an understanding of the difference between the scientific meaning of the word theory and the layman meaning of the word theory. I'm going to talk very briefly about just a couple of examples from different scientific disciplines that support the law of evolution. We'll start with biochemical evidence, and this is when we use things like examinations of organismal DNA, RNA, or the proteins inside those organisms, and we look for the similarities in, for example, the DNA between different organisms to establish how closely related those two organisms are. And based on that, we can construct different family trees, if you will. This particular family tree involves looking at how similar a particular type of protein found inside an organelle inside cells called mitochondria, how similar this particular protein is when we compare that protein in yeast, which is a type of fungus, to a turtle or a duck, a pig, a monkey, a human, a moth, a fish, and then just looking at how closely related these organisms are based on how similar their cytochrome C protein is inside their mitochondria. And based on that, we can see that humans and monkeys are most closely related, but that we are still indeed at least distantly related to yeast, to moths, fish, turtles, etc. Okay. Now, oh, by the way, one other thing I forgot to mention on that last slide. If you have conserved regions on the molecule, that means that the region between two organisms, like say between a human and a yeast cell, if you say they have conserved regions, that means that a particular section of the protein in the yeast is exactly identical to the section in the human. And the more conserved regions you have between two species, the more closely related they are. How about some anatomical evidence for evolution? Well, a great example is to look at the bones that make up the arms of lots of different, for example, mammals and birds. And we can see that if we look here at a human arm, the pink area here is your humerus, that's your upper arm. The blue and the teal here are your radius and ulna. And then down here in green, it's very hard to see here, are the metacarpals. That's a fancy name for all of the bones that make up your wrist. And the yellow here is your phalanges, or the bones that make up your fingers. And if we compare that to what we see, for example, whoops, I'm going to erase this here, to what we see, for example, in, oh, I don't know, a whale. You can see a whale has a humerus, just like a human does, but it's shaped very differently. The radius and ulna are also much shorter, but look how long the phalanges are, the finger bones. Same thing with the bat up here. Bats have extremely long fingers. That's what makes up the bulk of their wing, and their humerus, radius, and ulna are a foreshortened portion. Even in a bird, we can see the same bones evident. They're just shaped differently. Okay, when you have the same structure appearing in two different species and they come from the same common ancestor, for example, since all of these organisms have a humerus, we know that an ancestor in the past that gave rise to birds, bats, cats, horses, humans, and whales had a humerus, and that quality of having a humerus was passed on down through millennia, through generations and generations, to all these different species of organisms. When you have a structure that is derived from a common ancestor and it's found in two different species, that's called a homologous structure. So the cat humerus is a homologous structure when compared to the human humerus, for example. Or the whale phalanges are a homologous structure to the phalanges of a horse. They may look differently shaped, they may even perform different functions for the organism, but because the structure are derived from a common ancestor, they are homologous. Now let's compare that term to the term analogous. Analogous structures are structures that serve a similar purpose but are not derived from a common ancestor. So if we look at the wing of a bird, for example, and we compare that to the wing of an insect, like a bumblebee, for example, the wings of a bird and the wings of an insect perform the same function, which is to allow the organism to fly. But you won't see a humerus in the wing of a bumblebee. Okay, so their wings are analogous to each other. They perform a similar function, but they are not homologous because they are not derived from the same common ancestor. Okay, what about vestigial structures? Last thing here on this slide. Vestigial structures are another good example of evolution because vestigial structures are leftover structures that no longer serve a function in an organism but once did in previous species that gave rise to that organism. So for example, we as humans have a tailbone. It's called the coccyx, C-O-C-C-Y-X, and the coccyx or tailbone is the residuals of what once was a tail in one of our ancestors. Okay, probably an ape-like ancestor. That coccyx is a vestigial structure. It doesn't serve a use for us anymore. It's just a leftover from a previous time when it was useful. Another good example, and I'm just going to go back here through the slides, is if you look at this fossil of a whale, I'm going to circle right here some tiny little bones that are completely disarticulated, meaning they are not connected to any other part of the whale. This whale doesn't have legs, but those are leg bones. Those are vestigial structures. They are leftover leg bones from a period of time when whales actually were land organisms. And you might be surprised to know that whales are derived from a wolf-like ancestor, which was a four-legged dog-like organism that eventually returned to the sea, and over millions of years the body became very streamlined for moving in the water, and as a result legs became unnecessary, but we still have vestigial leg bones like a vestigial femur or thigh bone present in whales of today. Another example of evolution. Okay. Moving along here, last slide. How about a little discussion of some fossil evidence? If we look at the fossil record over millions of years of the ancestors to the modern horse, we can see that way back 60 million years ago, the ancestor to the modern day horse was a very small four-legged organism about the size of a small dog. And that if we sample the fossil record present in rocks over time, we can see that over 60 million years we went from that kind of an organism, a very small dog-sized organism, to our very large modern-day horse. The key here to understanding the changes that occurred between the ancestor to the modern-day horse and the modern-day horse is being able to find what are called transitional fossils. Fossils that show what kind of changes occurred between 60 million years ago and the modern day. And those different changes, such as this organism beginning to walk more and more on its tips of its toes, are what are evidence for how we understand how this organism, way back 60 million years ago, gave rise to the modern day horse. And that concludes our lectures on evolution and natural selection.